So far, we did a great job at creating basic applications and maybe a little bit more advanced applications such as the quiz application that we've been looking at earlier. Now, in the middle of all of that, of all the things that we've done, we have this activity that we briefly talked about. You probably heard me speaking a little bit in passing about activity and how activity is simply just a window. And that's true, but there is indeed more to the story. And so now I think it's a time for us to dig deeper and see if we can understand even further what activity is really doing behind the scenes. Now, I created a new project here so that we can actually focus on this topic only. So, create a new project. I call this project Activity Life Cycle because that is one thing that we're going to be talking about here. Now, the moment you look at our main activity.java here, knowing that an activity essentially is a screen that we then put things into it so that users can interact with, in a nutshell, right? So, when we say this activity here, main activity here is connecting to activity main XML. We've established that because we have this set content view, which goes and pulls in the activity main XML. Okay, so in a nutshell, this is what we see in our activity. Move this a little bit there, right? Very good. But let's understand exactly what's happening here. So in our main activity here, notice that we say public class and we say main activity. So up till this point, this is just any Java class you can create until we say extends app compact activity. You notice that there's a lot that has been appended here in this name, in this activity class. So instead of just activity, we have app compact. Okay. The reason why we use, or the Android Studio rather, extends app compact instead of just activities, because we just want to make sure that whatever we are adding, whatever we are extending, or whatever we're inheriting for our activity here, it's actually from the app compact or app compatibility modules or classes that allow us to do backward compatibility. You see, as I said before, Android is growing, right? And as it grows, we have different levels of APIs, different versions of Android. And so App Compact, among other things, allows us to get all of those backward compatibilities of things that earlier versions were able to do, or were able to do to earlier versions of Android. We will still be able to do that as we move forward. Hence, you see App Compact instead of just activity. Okay? Very good. So if we're extending activity, that means, as you know by now, you should know at least about inheritance and about overriding methods. You notice right away we have this override here on create. So it turns out an activity, this main activity, because extends an activity, or app compact activity in this case, just an activity, we have to override this on create. But what's really happening here? Well, the reason why we are overriding this on create, we're saying that, okay, the moment that this class is called, we want to override on create because this is the method that is responsible to create our activity per se. So now we're going into the life cycle of an activity. Now, this is what we've been looking at so far because it's the simplistic entry point of any activity we will ever create. Okay? And of course, we are passing a super on create. That means we're invoking the super, which in this case is going to be app compact activity class. We're invoking the onCreate method and passing the saved instance state, which is a bundle. We'll talk later about that, but just think of it as certain states that we can actually save to use when we invoke onCreate. In this case, we can abstract that out for now. Okay? So still inside of onCreate here, we have this set content view, which we learned before. All it does, it pulls in the activity main.xml so that we can render the actual view to our users. Okay, very good. So far so good. We've seen this. Now the beauty of this onCreate method here, in the background, what's happening is the moment the application comes alive, meaning the moment that we run application, we can see this app on device. This of course is called when things are ready. What it means is this is the place where we're going to set everything, all of the user interface, so that users will be able later to interact with. Now, all of these callbacks, all of these stages, all of these life cycles, especially this one, first life cycle I'm talking about here, it happens very instantaneously. Okay? In fact, if I come here, I'm going to put a toast that make text here, I'm going to put a main activity as our context. At this, the text is going to say something like on create, called, and toast, short, and I'm going to go ahead and show it like this. Okay, let's save this and give it a quick run. And you can see on create called, right? That means that was the first thing that was called when this this activity here was first ran. Very good. Now, because we're talking about an activity, of course, if it has this on create, you can imagine that it's got to have other override methods and callbacks that are attached to our activity because we extend our app compact activity, right? So if you thought in those cases, you're right. So there are other methods, other override methods, which we call the life cycle of activity. So an activity has its own life cycle, just like we as humans have our life cycle, right? You conceived, you grow in the womb, you're born, you grow outside, and inevitably at some point we perish, we die. Don't mean to be morbid here, but that is the truth. That is indeed a life cycle. So activities also have life cycles, but how do we then express those life cycles there? But before we go further, let me show you a diagram of a life cycle of an activity here. So here is our diagram of a life cycle. So I got this from the Android developer website, Google Android developer website. Okay, so it's very simplistic. So the moment the activity is launched, this is what happens. The onCreate here is invoked, which we saw. Once the onCreate is invoked, minutes, seconds, or even milliseconds later, the onStart is indeed invoked. Once the onStart is invoked, the onResume is invoked, and that's when we have the activity running. So all of these states here, all of these callbacks, all of these stages from the launch of activity to the actual running of activity, we go through these three phases here. Now, there's other ramifications, of course, as you can see here, which we'll talk in a second here. But this is the process. So once it's running, you can see here another activity comes into the foreground. What happens? Well, the previous activity goes on pause. So what happens exactly within these states? Well, on create, we say that is when the user interface is set up. That's the reason why we have this set content view. And that's also the reason why, remember, whenever we have an activity here, we put any widget, text view, a button, or anything else, this is where we instantiate everything. This is where we register our widgets to pick up the IDs that we created here, as you saw previously. The reason why is because the onCreate is the place where we have to set up our user interface. Okay, so coming back here, once onCreate is done, then we go to the onStart. So by the time we get to onStart, that means the user interface is ready, established, and ready to be used, meaning the users can now start tapping and interacting with our application. Okay? But that is not until onResume actually happens. But the final preparation actually happens on resume, because this is when everything comes foreground, meaning users are able to see the user interface, and right then we have the activity running, meaning that is everything is set up. We went through onCreate, onStart, onResume. Now everything is set up. The user interface is set up. The user interface is ready to be interfaced with, and now everything is running perfectly. So this is the green part where you can see your app, you can do things with it. Okay? If there is any interruption, what happens is then we go to on pause. So on pause is the place where the activity is kind of in a limbo, right? It's not dismissed completely. So for instance, if you're on an application and you get a phone call, right? What happens is that if you were using this other application, which must have an activity, right? What happens now is that we go on pause. So the activity goes a little bit on the background here. It's no longer visible as it stays. And then, depending on the situation, goes to on stop. Okay? So the on stop, the activity is completely out of the picture. So it's not visible anymore. As it says, the activity is finishing or being destroyed by the system. If in this case here, you're still on your phone, but you were interrupted by some other application or a phone call, then at some point, the activity will go on destroy. At this point here, it's getting ready to shut down. Once this process is done, it goes to the activity shutdown mode. Okay? But you can see these ramifications. You can see here on stop, if things go back to where they were, we can go back to the process and go back to onCreate and so forth. But this linear progression of events is exactly how an activity works. This is what we call the activity lifecycle. Now, why is this so important, you may ask? Because there's a reason why we're even talking about this. Now, if you really think about this, you can see that there's so many things that we can do as these lifecycle steps happen. We said that onCreate is where things are being created. It's where we can set everything up so the users in a few steps can actually interact with our application. Hence, this is why, like we said, is where we set up our user interface and all this stuff, right? So imagine that you're creating an application that requires, for instance, some sort of data from somewhere else, okay? Let's say via an internet, via HTTP request, okay? You will understand that in preparation for things to happen, meaning that if the data that we need to retrieve, let's say from a database somewhere else, it's very important for our application, for that matter, right? You can start thinking that, okay, where would be the best place for me to prepare all of that? Let me go back there, right? Where would that be the best place for me to make sure that before we show anything to the user, right? Or as the users click a button, once the activity is running and so forth, and the user clicks on a button, when would be the best place for me to actually stop, or making sure that I'm going to be able to go fetch that data and do something before I present to the user? That is the power, because now I have this capability to say, okay, the moment, for instance, on pause is created, meaning that I'm being interrupted, meaning that this activity, this screen that user is interacting with is about to go extinct. So I may, for instance, want to do a few things, maybe get rid of certain resources, maybe saving the user's data if they were playing a game, for instance, all sort of things that you can do. Now you can do that, and you can know that these things are happening because we are able to follow this cycle in code. Does that make sense? So now we can respond to whatever needs to be happening as things happening. So if it's on stop, my application on stop, and the person was playing my game on this activity, now I can say, okay, it is on stop. I can go ahead and call in a method which will take care of all of cleaning up, getting rid of resources, images, sounds, whatever it needs to be doing. And at some point, to make sure that everything is still working fine, I can say, okay, before we get to this on destroy, because at the point where we get to on destroy, that is before we get to activity shutdown. So this would be probably the best way, the best place for us to save the data or whatever else we want to do. Right? So that way, before it's shut down, before the activity is gone forever, all of the memory, all of the states is gone forever, I can go ahead and save whatever I need to do so that next time the user comes back on create, we'll have that data that we saved, as opposed to losing everything. All right? Very good. So in this video, I was able to take you through this process of understanding what happens with activity life cycles. In each step, there is this callback that we can actually tap into if we need to do so that we can do certain things as needed in our application. So this makes our development much efficient, much easier, and more congruent with how devices work, right? Because things happen as your applications are running, users get distracted, or perhaps there's other phone calls are coming, or maybe there's another app that comes in, all sort of things. So we need to manage all this life cycle so that our application doesn't end up not responding correctly and users end up losing their data and so forth. Okay, so in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to actually implement all of these override methods, which are the callbacks for our lifecycle. Very good. I'll see you next.